Hey guys, so in today's video, I'm going to be sharing a really unique and special story that was given to me by one of the viewers here on the channel. For the sake of this video, I'm going to be just calling him J-Rod, or Rodriguez for short, just to protect his identity. I really wanted to try and figure out a way to condense this video down, to make it more short and sweet, cut to the point, but I mean, there's a lot to cover here, and there's a lot that I'm excited to share with you guys, so this is going to be a little bit of an in-depth video, and what we're going to be seeing is really how these spiritual ideas look when they're put into practice. The ideas that I'm sharing with you guys are not just simply ideas that are fun to play around with. There's a very practical element to some of the things we're working with here. And so in this video, you're going to be seeing how these concepts can serve to establish a conversation between the ego and the unconscious mind. Stay tuned.
Today I'm going to be sharing with you the most profound event that has occurred in my life.
The most profound experience of my adult life. I was routinely using psilocybin. I was using the mushroom almost as an educational tool. Every time I would use the mushroom, I would learn new things about myself, new things about others, and new things about the world at large. I decided to take a very average dose this time. I laid down on my bed and I started listening to some 70s music. Pretty quickly though, I recognized that there was something really unique about this experience. Only a half hour in and I felt as if I was already peaking. I said to myself, boy, I'm really in for a treat this time. Right away, I started to see lines of geometric light standing in front of me. It was as if the music that I was listening to was animating these visual hallucinations of light, and they were forming all kinds of fractal patterns out in the space in front of me. The next experience I had was a feeling as if I were falling asleep, and this was a really strange sensation. I felt as if I was slipping deeper and deeper into a state of sleeping without actually losing consciousness. I was entering an altered state of mind. At this point, I closed my eyes, and inside my mind, I was experiencing the most intense dream that I had ever experienced. I looked out in front of me and there was this sphere of grass floating there in space, and on top of the sphere was a white house, and I decided to approach the house, and when I came inside of it, I looked and there before me was a room of ancient wisdom, like a primordial library of infinite insight. When I came into the room, I felt as if I was becoming increasingly conscious. It was as if I was entering a state of lucidity. I opened my eyes because I felt an intense feeling of dread. I felt as if I were dying, as if I were stuck in this moment forever, as if time would just simply never end. This was not just simply the end of my life, it was the end of my dream. It was the end of the world. I looked up in front of me and there was a stream of mathematical knowledge streaming down from the sky.
Just a bunch of math coming down and a bunch of information just flowing into me, and it was like blue math information.
It was like blue equations of mathematics that were simply coming down and being absorbed directly into my body. I felt as if I intuitively understood all the symmetries of nature, all the mathematical laws that govern the universe we occupy. I looked and there in front of me was a white mask. It felt as though I was wearing this white mask, and slowly it began to lift off of my face and float out in front of me into space. I saw this mask come off and simply dissolve into the void. At this point, the feeling of dying was becoming overwhelming. I started to weep and I prayed, saying, God, I'm not ready to die. God, please don't kill me. There's so much yet that I have to do. At this point, a voice calmly spoke to me, and it said, consciousness never dies, it simply transforms. As soon as I comprehended the meaning of this statement, it was as if an intuition exploded inside of me. I suddenly became completely aware of the fact that I was infinite, that I could never be born, and I could never die. I was simply a manifestation of this divine consciousness. It was at this point that I felt myself lift up out of my body. I floated there in the space in my room, and when I looked down at my body, I could see light streaming out from my eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. every gateway to consciousness was simply flooded over with light. As the light was streaming out, I recognized that I was speaking in different languages. Suddenly, I felt as though I could speak Hebrew, Aramaic, any ancient language that I wanted to. This language was the wisdom that was being poured into my body, and I understood the meaning of consciousness. I understood the significance of God. I understood all spiritual realities. I returned to my body, and I re-entered the dream that I had occupied earlier. There, in front of me, was a man wearing a suit. But when I looked at the man, I recognized that I couldn't see the top of his head. At the level of his eyes, it was as if his head had been cut off. The top of his head was not just missing, but had been hollowed out, like a chalice of some kind, wherein which something can be poured in. This figure turned towards me, and he said, "You are me, I am you, we are one." I moved in, and I absorbed into his very being. He came into me, I came into him, and then I experienced being completely one with this entity. I felt as though I had never been born, I would never die. I was the I am. During this experience, I kept hearing voices saying, "He is the Messiah, He is the Messiah, He is the Messiah, He is the Messiah, He is the Messiah." At this point, I had another visionary experience, as if I was floating out of my body and traveling through all kinds of different environments. A voice was saying to me, "Look at all the places you're going to go. Look at all the people you're going to bless with this wisdom. Look at all the people you're going to enrich with this light of truth." And I was moving through space and time, seeing myself in the future, seeing myself helping and benefiting others with this knowledge. It was at this point that I saw an extremely bright sun shining out before me. It was surrounded by pink and red and yellow lights. I moved closer and closer towards this light until eventually I blacked out. I can't remember what happened at this point. The next thing I remember, I'm back in my room, I'm back in my body, and this time I'm looking up at the ceiling, but the ceiling has been completely dissolved by this white light. I move up into the light, and there, in the midst of this light, I see a geometric form, something like the Star of David. It was turning ever so slightly through space, and there on the front of the star was an eye of infinite consciousness. And the star was divided between a left and a right. On the right side was a burning fire, and on the left side was a brilliant white light. Off to the left of this star, I then saw the figure of Jesus. He was standing there, staring at me with a very stern and serious look in his face, but he also had a subtle sense of joy. I recognized his power, his dignity, and his presence of truth. At this point, I returned again to my body. I was lying there on the cold tile floor, sweating profusely. I couldn't understand what had just happened to me. I was completely terrified. So the first thing that I find really fascinating about this testimonial is how he describes entering an altered state of consciousness, and he follows the textbook stages for entering an altered state of mind. First, he sees the entoptic phenomena. These are the geometric patterns and lines of light that people will see as they begin to enter an altered state of consciousness. The next thing that happens is he enters a kind of construal phase in which the geometric lines begin to form within himself a vision or a dream. And then finally, he enters a complete state of lucidity wherein which he can no longer distinguish the real world from the dream world. He has appropriately entered a complete altered state of consciousness. This is what the Sand Bushman would describe as entering the spirit world. The next thing that we confront is he describes how he feels as though he is falling asleep without actually losing consciousness. And again, this is a textbook definition of what it means to enter an altered state of mind. The spectrum of consciousness that I sometimes reference here on the channel describes how we move from an experience of waking consciousness into a state of daydreaming, then into a condition of hypnagogic state, somewhere awkwardly between being awake and being asleep. Then we begin to enter a dreaming state, and then we enter a condition of complete unconsciousness. This is the void of dreamless sleep. Now, the intensified trajectory that Dr. David Lewis Williams talks about in many of his books is described as an experience of moving along the spectrum of consciousness but not losing our condition of waking awareness. And he describes this. He says that he feels as though he is becoming more and more awake.
I started becoming more and more awake, more and more aware.
He is quite literally waking up inside of a hallucination, inside of a dreaming experience of reality. Of course, the library of infinite wisdom is a perfect metaphor for the anima archetype. This represents the fact that he has discovered within himself the primordial wisdom of the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind is a repository of ancient and primordial insights into the nature and contents of our soul. Of course, the intense feelings of dread are a perfect example of what shamans describe going through. Everyone who enters the spirit world describes this profound feeling as if they are dying. And I can honestly tell you, I've experienced this a few times myself, and you feel as if you are really dying. It's a horrifying experience. Of course, this description of time ending as if you're trapped in this place is a common experience that people will describe. And it's the fact that in the unconscious mind, there is no nice, neat, and tidy line of causality. There's not this nice and neat, tidy system of time. You see, in the unconscious mind, the past and the present and the future will all collapse in a feeling of a single moment. This is really the description of eternity. Eternity is not a long, long time. Eternity is a point, a mystery, out of which everything comes, into which everything goes. So you see, when the Bible talks about people burning in hell forever, it's not saying that they're going to burn in hell for a long, long time. Rather, think of it this way. The souls that burn in hell are literally burning into eternity. Think of eternity like a point, like a big drain or perhaps a tornado, and down at the bottom is the eternity out of which the universe comes, into which the universe goes. And the souls that burn in hell burn because they are literally being dragged down into the singularity, into the point of eternity. I remember in my own psychedelic experience when I saw that black hole up in the sky, that's exactly what I felt. I recognized that my dream was being pulled into the singularity, into this still point of eternity out of which everything comes, into which everything goes. And this is expressed beautifully in the yantra of the Hindus. At this point, he starts to receive visions of wisdom. He sees mathematical information streaming down from heaven above, and this represents the sense of the Logos, the Word of God. This is the Word of God that organizes the cosmos. And then after this, he experiences a mask being lifted up off of his face. And in fact, it was neat the way we came to this, because I was describing to him a metaphor for understanding the relationship between the ego and the divine consciousness of God. I said to him, the way to think about it is that the ego is like a mask that God is wearing. We are the mask on the face of God, so that every person you meet, the personality that they're carrying, the persona, the ego, is this mask that sits on the face of the self-archetype. And this is precisely what he describes. He is experiencing the ego being lifted off, and he is realizing his divine consciousness. He says he hears a voice that says to him, consciousness never dies, it simply transforms. And this is a universal spiritual truth. We find this in so many different religious traditions. The Buddha nature is that which moves from lifetime to lifetime. The Atman is never born and never dies. He is indeed the Brahman. The Holy Spirit of God was breathed into the nostrils of Adam, and he became a living being. The consciousness of God is never born and it never dies. It simply transforms. So as soon as he realizes the meaning of this statement, consciousness never dies, it simply transforms, he is immediately liberated from the sensations of fear, doubt, and disbelief. This explosion of intuition is an explosion of realization. He is realizing his infinite nature, his Christ-like nature, the nature of the Buddha that dwells within his heart. In the next scene, he begins to enter the spirit world appropriately, and he lifts up out of his body, and he sees the white light shining out through all of his sense organs. And this is a really fascinating thing, because this is actually a symbol that I've seen in someone else's dreams. A good friend of mine said that he had a dream in which he saw all these figures standing in an open field, and they were all looking up to heaven, and they had their mouths and their eyes wide open, and out of their mouths and out of their eyes was pouring this white light that was just shooting straight up to heaven. And after interpreting that dream, I immediately recognized what this dream represented. It represented the fact that he was now without a self. He was without any ego. The pure consciousness of God had now assumed his body. His body had become the incarnation of this divine consciousness. This is what is appropriately described as an ego death, the death of the self, the annihilation of the self. Now, the next experience he has is a man in a suit, and the suit expresses the fact that this is a man of dignity and power and authority. And the cut off on the top of his head, this, I have to admit, is a completely new symbol that I haven't seen. And the only interpretation for this that I can really think of is, again, a symbol of the fact that this individual is without self, without ego. He is devoid of all the egocentric qualities that we usually have. We always think of the ego as the heady qualities of a man, but this is a man who is devoid of all those qualities. In fact, later on, I'm going to be talking about another individual who sees this same spiritual figure, and he says this idea of him missing the top of his head expresses the fact that he is a being who is all-seeing and all-knowing. Wisdom is literally poured into the crevasse of his mind so that he is completely open to the nature of God's consciousness as it truly is. Now, it was really amusing because J-Rod had a really difficult time with this statement, he is the Messiah. 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 He was really worried about sharing this because he knows the Bible, and it says, in the last days there will come many false teachers and false messiahs, and he says, I don't want people judging me and saying that I'm one of these. And I said, don't worry about it. This actually goes back to one of my recent videos where I talked about connecting the Christ concept with the Buddha concept. You see, in the context of this experience, actually saying that he is the Buddha would have been a more appropriate symbolic term, but this is not something that exists within his experience of spirituality. So this is a reference to this archetypal image of the primordial man, the indweller of the heart, the Buddha, the Krishna, the Atman, this eternal and infinite personality of Godhead that dwells within each and every one of us. And this is what's being expressed by saying he is the Messiah. That's to say J-Rod is the Messiah, and the man who is missing the top of his head is the Messiah, and the two have been merged into one. This is the wedding supper of the Lamb, wherein which the ego and the self-archetype have been merged into one. After this, he has a really proper spiritual experience of flying out over the world and seeing all of the things he's going to do in the future, all of the people that he's going to benefit. And this is a beautiful example wherein which the soul is represented as the eagle flying through the air. The soul has been liberated from the experience of being bound to the ground, and so therefore the soul is lifted up from the earth and set free to experience the spiritual dimension, to move wherever he wishes through time and space. Next thing, of course, is the experience of seeing the white light. And again, I talk about this a lot, where this is the Dharmakaya, the white light of the Godhead. This is the source out of which everything comes and into which everything goes. And this is really a profound mystical experience. And I really appreciate the fact that he was honest about the fact that he lost consciousness in this white light. This is something that is ineffable. It's something that cannot be described. And I, too, remember when I came into that light, coming into it, and being incapable of comprehending what it was that was going on. I've often thought back to that experience. I remember going into the light and becoming the light, but there was no time, there was no moment wherein which I could say I, or this, or that. It was pure awareness with no bounds, with no limits, and it was also pure ecstasy. I could have been in that white light for 1,000,000 years and never have known it. And in fact, the Buddhists talk about this. They say that when most people enter this white light, they completely lose consciousness, and they just simply they lose their ability to comprehend what it is that's happening, and they lose consciousness like someone who falls into a very deep sleep. Next, he comes back into his body, and then he looks up at the ceiling to see again this white light. And he looks out in front of him, and he sees this geometric shape. And in fact, I was so inspired by this story that I went ahead and I actually made one here. This is what's called a small stellated dodecahedron. This is actually a well-known shape within mathematics and geometry. And the fundamental thing about this shape that's so fascinating, it was really a lot of fun, me and him trying to figure this out, because he originally told me about the way this shape looked. He said that it looked something like the Star of David, but that it also had a pentacle inside. And I thought, well, that's not really possible. You can't fit a pentacle inside of the Star of David. It just doesn't work. It doesn't coordinate very nicely. So we started to explore some things, and one day he messages me on Facebook, and he says, oh my God, I found it. He says, and that was when he realized that the object that he saw was actually this stellated dodecahedron. Now, that was extraordinary, because what it meant was that this was a real shape that he saw, and he didn't recognize it until much later on. I mean, this experience was the better part of 2 years ago, and it was only recently that he actually managed to recognize what this shape was. Now, what's really interesting about this shape is if you hold it at the right angle, you can recognize that it does look like the Star of David. You can see right there, that's the Star of David. You've got this defined shape around the outside. But if you turn it ever so slightly, you can recognize that it morphs into a pentacle. So what an incredibly sacred form this is, to express the fact that this shape encases both the hexagon and the pentacle. I mean, that's really extraordinary. But what's more interesting about this is the fact that this shape is in fact based on a dodecahedron. The foundational shape inside at the base of each of these peaks is in fact a dodecahedron, and that is not without significance either. It just so happens that I tend to be a pretty big enthusiast of these things. I really love these shapes that are called the Platonic solids. These include the cube, the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the icosahedron, and the dodecahedron. Now, what's really unique about all of these shapes is the fact that they are perfectly symmetrical, and in fact, within the 3 dimensions of space that we occupy, these are the only 5 shapes that can exist in this form. It was actually the famous mathematician Euclid who proved this back in the early centuries of ancient Greece. And what's really fascinating is that Plato, the philosopher, defined each of these shapes as reflecting one of the 4 basic elements. So he associated each of the Platonic solids with one of the elements. This dodecahedron was the shape that he associated with the quintessence, with the first of the elements, the 5th element, if you will. And I just so happen to have one of those as well. I actually made this quite a while ago. And you can see here that it's a kind of sphere of sorts, but it's made up of these pentagons, and it's absolutely a beautiful shape. And what I really love about this shape is that it serves as a great example of the self archetype, because really when you hold on to this thing, you definitely get the sense that it's somehow whole and complete and total in its essence. I'm thoroughly convinced that this is why Plato recognized this shape as being the quintessence, as the first of the 5 elements. It really has this intuitive sense of somehow being whole. Now, what's more is that these ideas played a significant role in understanding the nature of our solar system. Johannes Kepler was the first person to really put forward a compelling argument for the nature of our universe and for the symmetries of our solar system by arguing that all of the planets move in orbits that match and coordinate with the symmetries of the 5 Platonic solids. This is referred to as the Mysterium Cosmographicum, and I will post a link here where you guys can check out a video by Vsauce where he goes a little bit more in depth with this. I also recognize pretty quickly that this small stellated dodecahedron really serves as a 3-dimensional form of what's called Metatron's cube. In fact, when I was doing a lot of research on the 5 Platonic solids, I was frustrated by the fact that I couldn't find a 3-dimensional Metatron's cube. I tried looking online and trying to find somebody who had actually stretched this thing out into a 3-dimensional form, but really there wasn't anything that I could find. And then when I saw this shape, it was like it clicked, and I recognized, my God, this is literally Metatron's cube that we're dealing with here. So, I mean, this is an amazing experience where, J-Rod is seeing the symmetries of the universe expressed in this beautiful symbolic form. And of course, the white and the fire side of this cube expresses the fact that this is like a yin-yang. This is a balance, a coming together of all pairs of opposites. I, the Lord, create light and I create darkness. I cause good and I cause evil. This is the Lord, the Supreme Spirit, the self-archetype that transcends all pairs of opposites, all dualisms within the created universe. I would argue that the I on the front of this shape also expresses the fact that this thing is conscious, that it is an expression of this divine consciousness from God. Now, this experience would be extraordinary in and of itself, even if we just stop the video here, but that's the issue with this, is that it just kept going. And what was really profound is that shortly after J-Rod's experience, his younger brother actually had a dream in which he saw not only this same shape, but also this headless figure as well.
I walked up to a star with the circle around it, and it was cut in half, but once I had fire, once I had light,
His younger brother said that he found himself in a dark void, likely the void of dreamless sleep. And then from there, he was out on a grassy plain that stretched out infinitely in all directions. This is really analogous to the world ocean, right? This ocean of grass that stretches out in every direction. There on the horizon, he said that he could see a very small little dot. And as he started to move swiftly towards the dot, he recognized that it was in fact a castle. Now keep in mind, J-Rod's brother is maybe, I think, 11 years old, something like that, so he's quite young. But he describes how he sees this castle, and when he approaches the door, a man in a navy blue suit opens it. And he has a cloth over his arm, expressing the fact that he's a kind of servant, and he's carrying a tray. But he says that this man has no head. He can't see the rest of his head. He meets this gray and red hooded figure that leads him off into another room, and this room is filled with all kinds of books about the occult and mysteries of the spirit world. This again is this metaphor for the unconscious mind. He's come into the repository of unconscious wisdom. Inside of this room, he sees this star that's half white light and half fire, and he moves into the star and then finds himself out in space, floating among the galaxies. And this figure comes with him, and they move around and they look at all of these galactic forms floating out there in space until eventually they arrive at two portals.
And then he showed me these two portals. One portal he wanted me to go through, and which one had a bunch of fire, and the other one had a bunch of light.
And so this aggressive figure, he goes into the portal of fire, whereas J-Rod's younger brother goes into the portal of light. And he says that he sees two sets of galaxies that are merging into one. And on the one side is a fiery red set of stars that are all chaotic and messy. And on the other side are these bright, luminous stars that are filled with light, and they're orderly and set in a particular way. And he says that he moves towards the stars, and I really love this bit. It's at this point that he realizes that the stars are not really stars at all, that they are in fact clouds. And this is a great example of how dreams can just playfully manipulate forms. And he comes into the midst of these clouds, and he sees his brother, J-Rod, standing there. And J-Rod has these scars all over his face. But then off to the side of him, he sees this other figure, the figure of Jesus, standing next to him. And Jesus reaches out, he touches his body, and all the scars disappear and go away. He says that he then leaves out of this portal, and it's there that this hooded figure meets with him again, and he's angry that he took the portal of light instead of the portal of fire, and he strikes him across his face, and it was shortly thereafter that he said he woke up. And what's really amazing about this dream is the fact that J-Rod never communicated any of the details of his experience to his younger brother. So his younger brother is seeing similar mythological forms without having any of those forms presented to him ahead of time. In fact, he had this dream before J-Rod even knew that this shape that he saw was the stellated dodecahedron. That is really extraordinary. Later on still, another close friend of J-Rod's had another experience in which he also saw this kind of figure without the top of his head attached, and he was standing in the midst of a yin-yang symbol expressing this coming together of the pairs of opposites, and so he as well had this kind of an experience. So this is really extraordinary. What this tells us is that J-Rod's experience of the spirit world was powerful enough and impressive enough that it actually affected the psyches of people around him. The spiritual energies that he brought in through this experience have now started branching out and influencing the people around him. You see, these are the experiences that should inspire us to pick up a particular religious method. And in fact, I'm encouraging J-Rod to go out and find a religious practice. At first, I encouraged him to look at Kabbalah and Judaism due to the fact that he was seeing Kabbalistic symbols in his dreams. But Jesus always plays a prominent role in his mystical experiences, so it's obvious that he has to stick with something of a Christian orientation. And for that reason, I'm encouraging him to look into the Catholic faith, to look into the Orthodox religions, and perhaps to still retain some form of Christian Kabbalah to supplement his spiritual practice, seeing as this is something that his unconscious mind has presented to him on a number of occasions. But one thing I will say is that as soon as J-Rod chooses a religious method, I would not be in the least bit surprised if many of these experiences subside, if not entirely go away. And this might seem like a bit of a shock. I mean, why is it that when you choose a religion, you end up not having these experiences? Well, in many cases, these kinds of religious experiences describe what I would say is metaphorically like going into the emergency room. You see, before any of this, J-Rod had no religious affiliations, no spiritual connections whatsoever. He was really kind of a quasi-atheist agnostic. It just wasn't something he was worried about. But this experience really awakened him to the true nature of mind, to the nature of a spiritual life. And this shock to his system has compelled him to pursue a religious and spiritual form of life. Once you've made the decision to embrace a religious method, to take on a spiritual path, then that's no longer like going to the emergency room. You know, you go to the emergency room in a hospital, they throw the paddles on you, they inject you with something, you know, it's a big shock, everything's happening all at once. But a religious life, a spiritual life, a devoted life is something like eating healthy every day. Going to the emergency room is not really where you want to be. This is analogous to somebody having a life-shattering religious experience. This is the equivalent of going into the emergency room. Rather, what we want is a slow and steady path to God, something that doesn't require the complete smashing of our ego, but rather something wherein which we allow ourselves to surrender a little bit more of our pride each and every single day. And this is the authentic spiritual life. This is the authentic religious practice. So if you're watching this and you're saying, you know, I've spent 30 years as a Christian and I've never once had an experience like this, well, you know what? That might be a good thing. It might be an indication that, in fact, you are taking a little bit of a step towards God each and every single day. But if you really want to have an experience like this, you've got to push the envelope. You've got to drive your soul into those altered states of consciousness and explore those liminal places between waking and dreaming. And it's there that God perhaps will meet you and take you on the journey of a lifetime. So I hope you guys enjoy this video. As always, I'd ask you to like, subscribe, and share. Be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when I come out with new content. And as always, thanks for watching.